We acknowledge that Stanford occupies the lands of the Muwekma Ohlone Nation, the indigenous inhabitants of the San Francisco Bay Area, that these lands were dispossessed by colonization and white supremacy, that those processes were not events, but ongoing processes, and that we stand in solidarity with our indigenous peoples during this time of struggle and reckoning. Good afternoon. Welcome to the day 3 of the 5th annual conference of the Race, Inequality, and Language in Education program at Stanford University. This year's theme focuses on pursuing educational equity in uncertain times. We began this week with Linda Darling Hammond as a keynote speaker, and yesterday's session brought together an amazing group of scholars who focused on educational abolition. These scholars talked about a revolutionary way of looking at the challenges that lie ahead, and rather than proposing the reform of education, they proposed a transformative way of thinking about educational mindsets. Today's session will challenge us to think about an indigenous view on this moment of crisis, COVID-19, racism, online teaching and learning anxiety, and other disruptions to lives already lived unequally. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce our RILE graduate student host for today's webinar. Teresa LaFromboise is Nehio of the Muskeg Lake and Red Pheasant bands of the Cree Nation. She is currently a 3rd-year doctoral student in the Race, Inequality, and Language in Education program here at Stanford, where she studies the indigenation of universities. Teresa is a 2019 to 2022 Pierre Elliott Thoreau Foundation Scholar. Thank you so much, Teresa.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Tansi niwago maganak, neo kisigansek. Teresa LaFromboise Nitsigasun, nia nehia esqueo, maskeo sagahganik otunia. My name is Teresa LaFromboise, and I'm Nehiao from Treaty 6 Territory and a current student in the RILE doctoral program. It is my honor and privilege to begin today's session of the RILE conference featuring Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith, Dr. Marie Battiste, and Dr. Teresa LaFromboise. While the panelists are joining from across the world, I'm currently located on the homelands of the Ohlone Nation. As an uninvited guest to these lands, it is my hope that the work I contribute to while here supports the resurgence of all Indigenous peoples, and particularly the Ohlone. The dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands has had disastrous repercussions. In California, the prevention of Indigenous ways of caring for the land, including controlled burns, has led to the catastrophic fires we have seen this year. We all suffer when Indigenous ways of knowing and being are suppressed. Each of these panelists today have made vast contributions to the intellectual landscape and are what we would refer to in my language as Ogimau Iswewak, or leader women. All those who work in the field of Indigenous education build from the foundation that they have laid. I certainly would not be here today if it was not for them. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith, Maori of Aotearoa, is an internationally accomplished scholar and researcher who has worked in and influenced the field of Maori education and health for many years. Her groundbreaking book, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research in Indigenous Peoples, remains an international bestseller. Dr. Smith has held several positions, including the founding co-director of the Maori Center of Research Excellence, the Pro-Vice Chancellor Maori, and the Dean of the School of Maori and Pacific Development at the University of Waikato in Aotearoa. Dr. Marie Battiste, Mi'kmaq of the Podlotek Nation, member of the Order of Canada, is a full professor in the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Battiste's research has focused on education, social justice, and institutional change in the decolonization of education, in particular, teacher education and curriculum. She holds graduate degrees from Harvard and Stanford and a teaching certificate from the University of Maine, Farmington. I would like to acknowledge the ongoing fight for treaty rights that is currently under threat in her homeland of Mi'kmaq. Dr. Teresa LaFromboise of the Miami Nation is a counseling psychologist by training and a professor of education in developmental and psychological sciences in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Her research has focused on efforts of non-dominant racial and ethnic groups to thrive in the face of adversity, including acculturation demands, discrimination, and major life challenges. Teresa also chairs the Native American Studies program at Stanford University. All three of these exceptional scholars embody what I believe to be the core tenets of Indigenous research methodologies of reciprocity, generosity, respect, and humility. Please follow along today on social media using the hashtag RILE2020. Closed captioning is also available via Zoom. We will begin with a keynote from Dr. Smith, followed by a panel discussion. Please join me with some E-claps, E-snaps, and a kia ora to welcome Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to everyone, and greetings in particular from my land. And I've just got to get into a rhythm here with my PowerPoint. I hope you can see the shared screen. Now I can see it. But now I can't move it. There we go. So thank you, Jarita and Anitha, and those of you who have organised this conference. It's always wonderful to see Marie Battiste, a colleague and friend I've known for many years, and also wonderful to meet Teresa for the first time. It's a pleasure to talk to you across the ocean of the Pacific, Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, our ocean that my ancestors have travelled and navigated for many years. But I greet the lands of the people where Stanford is and the lands wherever any of you who are joining into this webinar are located. I greet you from my lands. And this is a kind of back view of the farm that I come from, looking at our mountain, our river, and all its kind of glory, if you like. It's not the most romantic view of Indigenous land. It's a farm, it's got weeds, it's all broken down, but it's my land. And I greet your land from my land. And I acknowledge the ancestors of all our lands. And I know that they're looking over us as we meet today in this kind of virtual seminar. So my talk is, as you can tell from the title, is everything except the kitchen sink. And that's because at the moment it's really hard to distill, I think, a focus specifically on education in a time of a pandemic. It's also difficult to kind of focus on kind of wider issues and contextual issues when we are all also focusing on our well-being, the well-being of those that we love, those who are close to us, and those who are afar. And I just I want to start by honouring people, honouring those who've passed during this pandemic. I know in the US, that's over 200,000 people, and worldwide, probably over 1 million. Also want to acknowledge those who care and love and mourn for those who've passed. I know how difficult it must be when people are locked down or don't have access to the support systems that might normally be available. And I do know what it's like to mourn someone whose funeral you can't attend because that happened to my family while we were in lockdown. I want to acknowledge those who serve, those who educate and communicate, who show leadership and courage. And also want to acknowledge those who are essential workers and volunteers and educators, grandparents, parents, and others who keep our communities safe and well. And that means pausing to have each of you honour yourself and to honour each other. So I'm going to give you a few seconds just to, give yourself a shout out and honour yourself, because that's really important. The next thing I want to do is do some remembering. So a pandemic is something the world has seen before. The last major pandemic was for us in Aotearoa was in 1918. The end of the Second World War was the arrival of the influenza epidemic, and that had a devastating impact on Indigenous communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as it did, and as this pandemic has also on Indigenous and Native communities across the world. So pandemics are really interesting because they disrupt everything. They turn it upside down, and it really challenges all our sort of taken for granted securities around our economic system, our political system, our health system in particular, but also our cultural and knowledge systems. Now, for Indigenous peoples, pandemics kind of trigger and unlock a whole lot of remembering, and a remembering that, is ultimately about cultural genocide, the invasion of our lands, the huge losses that we had to sustain over generations, and the destruction of our languages often, and systematic, purposeful attempts to get rid of us and to get rid of our cultures. And so this pandemic, in a sense, has also done that in my community. And that trigger is obviously triggers trauma reactions, and our peoples kind of remember, and what that kind of trauma was about. And we remember that in our actual bodies, and we remember it as something that broke us, in a sense, that broke the wholeness of us. And, the 1918 pandemic might seem a long way ago, but, my father, who was born just after that pandemic, or about a decade afterwards, maybe 2 decades, grew up with stories of the impact of that, because essentially we as Māori people in New Zealand were abandoned. There was a burgeoning public health system that wasn't really available to us, and we were left on our own. And that sense of abandonment was evident really in the stories that my father told about growing up. My grandmother also was a nurse during the 1918 pandemic. And she was not a trained nurse. She was the kind of community midwife but she was healthy. And one of the stories that she told that's always stuck in my mind is every morning, you know, the men would go out on horses to look to see how families were. And if there was no smoke coming from the chimney of a house, that was often a good sign that something was wrong, because there was no one there to light the fire. And so a house with no smoke coming out of the chimney was often a house of death. And, you know, I grew up with that story. But I think it's also really important not to remember just the trauma, but to remember across the generations that many of us survived, and that we have stories of survival, stories of healing, stories of, you know, little stories of being triumphant against the odds. And I think it's really important to remember our resiliency and to remember the strength of our grandparents and our ancestors who did what they could to live and to give us a life. So there are some Indigenous lessons for living in a crisis. They're fairly basic, like number one, try and stay alive. Our people, if anything, are very practical. And survival forces some things to be set aside, to be honest. All right, food, shelter, security often kick in as most basic things of survival. And we often have to give ourselves permission, give our people, our families permission just to stay alive, to do what they need, to stay well, to stay alive. Also, it's important to nourish the spirit within each of us, our Indigenous spirit, our ancestral spirit, our spirituality spirit, our sense of purpose spirit. And even when we may be, you know, in really hard times, it's often our spirit that helps drive us forward. It's important to stay connected. It's important to look after others, because in looking after others, you're also looking after yourself. Our well-being is in our connection. It's important to share. We have many examples during the 1-month lockdown we had in New Zealand of how our tribes mobilized, shut down their own borders, and developed a food supply system that really was way more effective than the government's, because they knew where everyone lived, they knew how families would have reorganized themselves during a lockdown, and they had really good food supply and distribution networks. But it's also about sharing, because, as you know, even in Indigenous communities, there are often significant inequities in terms of access to resources. I think, you know, often when you're locked down on your own or just with a few, the importance to love each other and to love others, I think really becomes kind of in the forefront of how do we get through this together. And part of that is just the simple act of loving ourselves and loving each other. It's important to remember, and not just remember the traumas, but to remember the survival stories. It's important to grieve. And, you know, there are times when grief overcomes people, overcomes whole communities, and essentially immobilizes you. So grieving is really important. It's a process of living. And if we don't pay attention to those, it doesn't go away, the need to grieve. Also, hope always is important, and rebuilding ourselves, or rebuilding what needs to be built because we might have put it aside or because it's been destroyed. There are some other lessons that are still relevant today that we learned from that 1918 pandemic. This is a picture of my grandson, his first day at school when he's 5. He's now 18. He'd be so embarrassed if I knew I was showing you this photo, but he's so cute. Anyway, some other lessons we know about crises is that power clings to power, especially in a crisis. Those with power just do not relinquish it. If anything, they use the opportunity to really embed power. And it's really important for us to kind of understand that, because just because it's a crisis doesn't suddenly mean they all care for us, and that, you know, the opportunities are ours to kind of seize. People who have a lot of resources have the resources to shore up their resources and protect them, but also the resources to get other resources. They can maximize their resources in a crisis. So the revealing of inequity around the world in this pandemic, you know, it's not really a surprise. It is only a surprise to those who thought they weren't implicated in it. All right? Those of us who've worked in the space of inequity have always known it existed. So why is it a surprise? Why is it a surprise that racism has reared as a kind of significant pandemic that underpins the response to the pandemic, that underpins our access to resources, that underpins the way different communities are treated, that underpins fundamental ideas of white supremacy, that excuses the fact that more people of colour die and are likely to die in a pandemic, that it's kind of seen as natural, that it's a natural phenomenon rather than a politically, socially, economically constructed sort of resource access. So crisis creates opportunities for deepening exploitation and widening social divisions. And we've definitely seen that in Aotearoa, and have worked really hard. You know, I always do a shout out to our Māori Indigenous medical workforce, because we have amazing Māori doctors, nurses across the spectrum of the health system who have been really proactive in mobilising through this pandemic to provide the kind of knowledge and resources and advocacy that our people have needed. They've done that in the face of, you know, once again being abandoned, once again being excluded from the general response of the government. So what our government did was just think, you know, it's a pandemic, we're all going to experience it the same, so the strategies are going to be one size fits all for everyone. And just that model alone kind of tells us that it's not going to work for our people. It has to be designed and redesigned so that it reaches care and resources reach our communities. They're not, you know, our communities are not the most trusting of health systems. And why indeed would we trust health systems when, you know, prior to the pandemic, the inequity of outcomes of our health system have, you know, really disproportionately impacted on Māori people and Pacific people. The hopeful side of me, though, will also say that crisis creates opportunities for transforming society in a good way. That's me being optimistic, because I think in order for that to happen, good people have to work really fast and really smart to try and seize those opportunities and make them work. They're not going to fall into our lap, right? I don't think the doors are going to be flung open and people in power are going to say, here we are, all you people of colour and marginalised people and oppressed groups. We really need you to come and help redesign the education system. We really need you to come and help, design the health system. It's not going to happen like that. I think what we need to do is push those doors down while they're looking the other way and storm in and say, these are the things that need to happen. So leadership is important. And I think one of the lessons in our communities is our community leadership has really held our people together. Community engagement is important. There's no use having leadership if the community are at 6s and 7s and don't share values and are not interested in the collective good. Community engagement is about a notion of community, a notion of collectivity, and wider strategies of well-being. So one of the reasons I think these are important and why I'm spelling them out is even in a pandemic where, particularly say in the Northern Hemisphere, not just in the United States, but in a number of other countries, there's been this huge battle over science. And you might think, well, what role does Indigenous knowledge have in a pandemic? Well, everything I've said so far is really about the contribution Indigenous knowledge makes to the well-being of our communities. It's not just about the science of public health. It's not just about the science of how we keep a virus at bay. It is also about the knowledge we need to keep ourselves well, the knowledge we need to keep everyone in our community to care for the collective, the knowledge that we need to love each other in a good way, the knowledge that we need to sustain ourselves when times are hard, to feed ourselves, to feed others. All of that, I think, speaks from my perspective to the real importance of Indigenous knowledge in a time of a pandemic. So I want to pause here, and this is one of my favourite pictures at the moment. You can hopefully see what this is. And really the question I ask people, because this is about Indigenous knowledge, is if you did not know the shape of an egg, how would you put these shells back together again? All right, that's my question. And then the other thing I would say is actually all the components that you need to put the egg together again aren't actually there. At least a third of them have been stolen, and they're probably sitting in museums all around the world. A third of them have actually disappeared. We don't know where they've gone. We know they're not lost, but right now we can't find them. So in essence, what we're looking at is a third of the components that we might need to put this together. Now that's really how I describe the struggle that Indigenous peoples have faced to revitalise and regenerate our knowledge. That often what we're trying to do is connect pieces that have been disconnected, connect pieces that have been lost, connect pieces that have been stranded all over the world. And if we don't know what the shape of our knowledge was, then we're trying to find what the clue is, what the codes are to put it together again. And I think one of the magical things for me about Indigenous knowledge is the more we use it, the more we learn the codes to put it together again. The more we practice it, the more we know what works in relation to each other, which shells might go together. The more we revitalise our language, the more we revitalise our knowledge of our environment, the more we practice those things, the more able we are to put things together. So the real challenge that I think Indigenous peoples have faced in the 20th century and in the early part of the 21st century has been a struggle over our knowledge and the sovereignty, our intellectual sovereignty over our knowledge. And I think the remarkable thing that we've done is to kind of practice it and live it and revitalize it and practice it and live it and keep revitalizing it and be really confident that in there, there's some beautiful eggs. Okay, so I am talking about education, but I'm also talking about well-being. And I am deliberately linking education to the sense of well-being and how, you know, we need to kind of remind ourselves that education is about a collective sense of well-being, the well-being of a community, but also the well-being of the planet, of our lands, our environments, of our atmospheres. And one of the things, messages I always give, you know, my students really is just remember we all have really cool ancestors. You know, some of them may not have been that cool. Some of them might have been individually a disaster. But if you just take it as a whole, we all had cool ancestors. How do I know that? Because we're all here. That's all you need to know, that we had fabulous ancestors. And our role is to strive to be the best ancestor. And so the role of education is, how does it make us be really cool ancestors? You know, how can school help us be a great ancestor? Ancestors live within us. You know, they're not just externally. We don't have to go looking for the ancestor. We have to remind ourselves that there are two parts. One is you can go looking for them externally, like the eggshells, which part of that eggshell is me. But you also need to look internally, because that is where they reside, because we are our ancestors. And that ancestral knowledge and that ancestral legacy is what makes us unique. It's also what binds us to other people. It binds us to other generations. And finally, they left us some things to do. They left us work, they left us clues and cues, and they left us songs. It's really important that we kind of sing those songs, because inside them is a map. It's a kind of map of where we've come from, our ancestral journeys. And in the map are some clues about where we might be heading for. So I just want to kind of give, well, how's my time, Teresa?
Yeah, I think we're getting close to having a conversation.
I'll speed it up. So this is just an intergenerational story. It's my father's story. And up on the highest point of the screen, the third man, I think, tall one, is my great-great-grandfather. He's just been arrested by police who invaded the community because they were living peaceful resistance and didn't want to engage with the Crown of New Zealand. And the Crown responded by sending in police to arrest them. And that's my great-grandfather. The next photo down is his daughter. So he's my great-great-grandfather. So the next one down is my great-grandmother. She has the traditional moko kauai on her chin. She's a beautiful woman, and she's actually the one who, for the most part, brought my father up. The next photo down is my grandmother and my father as a little baby. But my grandmother was left as a single mother and really had to go and work. And she left my dad with his grandmother. And the next photo down, which I'm in, is my father, my grandmother, and my sister and myself. Now you can look at that and think, oh, that's a nice family. Actually, it's a very fragmented family. My father didn't have a good relationship with his mother because she left him with his grandmother, and then she remarried. And the person she remarried didn't want to have anything to do with my father. And so it was a really difficult life that took us and took him most of his adult life to restore that relationship. So often inside our own families are these kind of trauma stories that we have to overcome, and they take more than a generation often to do that. So the next photo is my father, who is a professor of Māori studies, and my daughter. My dad was the co-curator of the Te Māori art exhibition that went to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and he's a fairly revered professor in Aotearoa. And there he is, he's 93, and he's thriving in this pandemic. And like many of our elders, you know, they're so resilient and so strong. They know how to survive, and they're not wusses about it. You know, it's like, okay, we've got to do these things. You know, let's get real about it. We've got to eat, you've got to grow, you've got to, you know, just get organized. Don't sort of fluff around. That's my dad. All right, so I'm going to move really quickly. And once again, I'm going to sort of emphasize the important role that education and educators play in well-being. And so this principle has come out of a big study we did on trauma. Everything you provide as an educator is medicine. So make sure it heals. What does the future look like for Indigenous education? You know, already we know from studies of Indigenous education around the world that there's some foundational ideas and philosophies. Everything is relational. We live in relation, and we have to live in relation ultimately to this virus and other viruses. We need to learn how to do that as if our lives depend on it. Education has to promote the well-being of the collective, not just the individual. It means we have responsibilities to look after everything and respect our environment. And our literacies have to encompass the fullness of us, the fullness of our lives, not just an intellectual part of it, or not just a kind of limited view of what schooling does. So what could it hold for the future Indigenous education? I mean, my first point is there are futures. There's not just one future of Indigenous education. There are multiple futurities, and every Indigenous community can imagine that because we know they have visions for their futures. We need a sort of different notion of the curriculum that really is grounded in our relational way of being and knowing. You know, just thinking about food issues during the pandemic kind of opens up a whole understanding of how we could live and know differently. Critical pedagogies of love and connection, of well-being and ceremony. We also need to be more explicit about those things. I'm having to do that as a teacher, to be much more open with my 100 level students who are feeling all kinds of anxieties. We do a 20-minute part of a tutorial, which is all about well-being and all about having a language to talk about our feelings and our anxieties. And our futures are more embedded in diverse kinds of families and homes and communities. And I think I've got to the end. A bit of a race.
Tēnā koe, Dr. Smith, it's really a pleasure to hear from you. I would now welcome Dr. Marie Battiste and Dr. Teresa LaFromboise to offer some reflections on, I think, what was a very rich presentation by Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Marie, we just need to, there you go.
Okay, thank you. And indeed, it is a pleasure to see all of you, to see friends, to see Linda again, and to indeed remember where we have come from and the importance of the remembering as we go through this, and the wealth that our Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledges bring to our current situation. I think that one of the things that we become, you know, so aware of is the inequities that have been accentuated by COVID, but also that COVID in my community created unemployment and unemployment beyond the unemployment that they had before, because people live by traveling in different places and making a living, surviving off the land and the woods, the waters, and so on. And so COVID created that kind of disconnect for people where they couldn't do that kind of work. And as a result, today, the issues that Mi'kmaq people have rights to hunt, to fish, to trade, to sell their goods, and that they are trying to survive in COVID, so trying to survive where they couldn't travel to do the potato picking. Like when I was born, I grew up in Holton, Maine, because we went in and traveled in the seasons. And so today we're dealing with COVID similarly, but we also not only see the inequities and the racism that is further accentuate the point that you made about how power digs in and doesn't want to give up any of its privileges and is taking away the rights of Indigenous people to do the very things that their treaties have given them rights to, and to which the courts have affirmed. So we're dealing with that. I know that there's others who want to say something as well, but I wanted to share with you my own analogy of the kind of the ways in which Indigenous knowledge have been put into a situation where it's sort of like the autumn seed I've written about before, where the autumn seed, gets thrown around at different places. And eventually the snow comes and the snow hides it. And sometimes even the seed may roll around on top of the snow and into new places. And it looks very bleak and it looks like all is gone. But Indigenous knowledge to me is the one in which when the spring comes, that seed will find its ground, will find its nourished yet again, and will again become the tree it was meant to be. And so when I think about Indigenous knowledge, I think about the kind of way in which our colonial history has created the seed that is being pushed around, and the winter has come and gone. And as the winter begins to recede, that seed begins to find its root. And its root is coming within community. It's coming in within our languages. It's contained within our sustainability livelihood. It's around family. And so Indigenous knowledge and education need to bring those things back together again, where Indigenous knowledge becomes the foundation, not just for Indigenous people to grow into themselves and recover, restore, and renew themselves through and build resilience, but it is an opportunity for non-Indigenous people to learn from, to grow within, and to begin to build a new philosophy and a worldview and a way of being in the world that is enriched by community, enriched by the love and nourishment of each of our learning spirits. And it is a very different kind of philosophy, which I think we need to begin to move towards. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jarita, as there's so many other questions and issues to raise. Thank you.
Well, Lalim, Dr. Battiste, Dr. LaFromboise, any reflections you'd like to share?
I was thinking about, from my perspective and the work that I do, where I go for short periods of time in different schools, usually tribal schools, to work in this area of suicide prevention and work with people, and I don't stay for a real long time. I come back and I leave. So I don't have the richness of thinking about the Indigenous knowledge of the Miami Nation of Indiana, because I live far from that and not that close to it. But I was really thinking about how I appreciated the fact that Linda talked about this idea of Indigenous knowledges and the idea of multiple futurities, because I've been trying to, I sometimes feel that I'm often saddened that it seems like different communities from different nations don't necessarily work collaboratively around a large scale effort, say building resilience or enhancing well-being. It seems like each community is its own, sovereign nation and wants to do it their way. And so and then the word sovereignty, I believe in it, I value it, I respect it, but also is kind of legalistic. So in its thinking in the term. And so I just love the idea of the futurities. I mean, because it's a new term, and I think it helps, because I was listening, the other day to Dr. Darling Hammond when she was talking about changes that might be possible because of COVID, because of the fact that schools are really struggling to address the mental health needs of the students and teachers and themselves, but also because everybody's scrambling to figure out what we can do for it to work online. And therefore it might be a time of and it's not focused so much on testing and making grade. So it is a time that schools could redesign, or that they might be more open to this, the term culturally sustaining pedagogy, or to just appreciating and being, I think a lot of people understand social emotional learning and the need for it, but they don't have the time to build it in because it always competes with academic content. So Linda was talking about, these are opportunities, this is a new time. So I thought, well, let me call some of the communities I've been working in and just see, is that realistic? And that's what I was doing this morning. And it was a very interesting conversation, because one tribal school is very much talking about what they do and what they're trying to do, and how they really are trying to find a balance between Indigenous knowledge and Western canon, and still get that done even in online learning. So that was one. Another was talking about how it's challenging for communities that are even very different tribal nations that are very close together to even work collaboratively in a multi-tiered kind of mental health opportunity that would be there if they work collaboratively as opposed to working individually. And then I'm also thinking of schools like down in the Grand Canyon. I don't want to label any tribe, but basically that where their teachers aren't necessarily even staying, and they can't, they're still trying to hire enough teachers to cover the classes, and certainly have don't have a very wide array of courses. And so it just feels very piecemeal. So I guess I'm going to hold on to that multiple futurities idea and try to stay optimistic and try to work with people. But and of course, as an outsider and a consultant, there's only so much you can do other than try to understand it and be flexible, because it's very hard to try to show leadership or encourage leadership to be a little bit more expansive and more empowering and be more community oriented in their resilience efforts.
Thank you, Dr. LaFromboise. I wish we could stay here all day, but we are close. But I would just like to have a quick question and a reflection. Many people who are joining us today on the webinar are non-Indigenous, but all will teach and work on Indigenous lands. What would you see as a necessary first step for instructors to meaningfully and respectfully engage with Indigenous knowledges within their classrooms?
Shall I answer? So one of the important pedagogies, I think, in the Indigenous world is that teachers are learners. Teachers are always learners, and learners are teachers. Learners are teachers. And I think, that's really a very powerful relationship between teaching and learning, teachers and learners. And the first thing, I think, is to learn. to find ways to learn and to be humble in your learning. There are lots of ways that that can come across as very awkward and difficult and challenging. I think humility is really important in this space, and sometimes just asking students what's okay with them in your journey is a good way to be able to do it in collaboration with your students and with your community. It's not always a priority in my own communities when we're trying to revitalize our language and our culture for ourselves. But we do know that our children need teachers in front of them who value Indigenous knowledge, who are prepared to incorporate it in the classroom, and who encourage students to work with it.
Can I speak to that? Okay. Indeed, I think that one of the things that I've learned from both Linda's work has been how important it is to unlearn, relearn, and then self-learn. And that was that in the course of the decolonization process, the deconstructing, unpacking, the recognition of the complicities that each one of us have in the, in various kinds of oppressions that are race, class, gendered, and that are of many other kinds of oppressions as well. And that we need to, really begin to examine ourselves as well as examine the society's knowledge base that we are utilizing in the classroom, recognizing that at a time of COVID, we have great opportunities to begin to really invite parents and community members and the small cohorts they are bound to in the home to really build on those stories, to build on that experience and their traumas and testimonies, and to understand what was going on in the lives of people during this time and to remember it and to keep it for the future. And so children today are in the home, are working sometimes with less connectivity and technology. So teachers really need to remember that it isn't all about the fancy stuff that's online, but really that the teachers, the original teachers, are those parents and family members that they have grown up with. And during the time when we didn't have education and when we were left pretty much alone because they assumed that we were primitive, that was our education time, where we went into the woods. We went in and we learned from the people, from our community members. So I think it's really an opportunity for us to rebuild a notion of connectivity to parents, to stories, to times of the past. And I would say that we can put away the Eurocentric canon curriculum and really rethink what is important to our lives now. And that, to me, is what I would suggest would help us, and which also would mean that we need to focus on nourishing the learning spirit, nourishing the gifts that we have, and begin to think about these children in the long term of what they are going to contribute to the communities that they are coming from.
Ooh, say it louder, Dr. Battiste. Throw that Eurocentric stuff in the trash.
Okay. Can I say something?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. When I saw, thinking about your question, I was thinking about the first time, I first thought that educators need to really examine why they want to do this work in the first place. What is it's motivating them to go and work in communities that they are not members of? I thought of that. I also thought of what it was like to be a beginning teacher and to be in a community that I was not a member of, and wanting to get to know my students as quickly as possible and wanting to meet their parents. And to me, and the way I did that is that I hand delivered their first report card. So I went to every home in order to do that, which was really a wonderful experience. But I think that it's very important to show that you really do respect the knowledge that's there and you want to learn, but you don't want to be pushy about it, and you want to find out who is willing to share that information with you, even in terms of just what elders are willing to talk to you, what community members are willing to, you know, just communicate with you, and that the real knowledge, I mean, I think the real learning lesson is realizing how little you do know and how the real resources are in the community, and being grateful for whatever you do learn, because it'll be with you for the rest of your life.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Teneko'e, Walalin, Kinenasminanau, to our panelists. It really is a gift to be able to share this space with you. And each of you has been consistently so generous with your intellectual talents and in mentoring many other generations of scholars who've come after you and build upon the foundation that you have laid for us. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to be able to sit in this virtual space with you, giving you all virtual hugs, miss you all a lot, and hand it over to Dr. Anita Ball.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this knowledge with us. Thank you so much, Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith, Dr. Battiste, and Dr. Teresa LaFromboise. Thank you so much for the knowledge that you've left with us. We thank you for the knowledge about communal knowledge, about deconstructing the knowledge that we have, unlearning and relearning, and think about why we're doing what we're doing. There is so much for us to learn from Native communities. And I hope that as we come together and as we try to plan post-COVID, that knowledge would be at the forefront of what we do and where we decide to go. Thank you so much. And so as we come to a close for today, we realize that it's time for us to go. I would like to thank our audience for being with us. And I would like to invite each of you to be with us again tomorrow, where we will be speaking about COVID-19 and race. We'll be continuing these conversations. So we'll have Dr. David Williams from Sociology and Public Health at Harvard University. We will have Dr. Michael Hines from Stanford, and we will have Karen Bell from Tulane University, all with specializations in these areas. And so we thank you for another day. There's so much. We have to talk to somebody about this. Find a friend and continue this conversation. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Pacific time. And until then, we wish you peace, prosperity, and vision. All best. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.